Okay, good. So, good afternoon once more. Today I want to present on how to find gaps in literature. In the communique, this was written as a live demonstration on PubMed, but we kind of already did that last week. And just to put this presentation in context for our program and what we've covered so far, we started in the first module looking at what research questions are, defining objectives, stating hypotheses. In the last presentation last week, Emma talked about how do you conduct literature search. And you can see that from conceiving a research question and defining it properly, you can set very clear goals and you have an idea of what you want to look for during literature search. And the aim of literature search is uncovering what is not yet known and what is known and what is not yet known, so that the research question you are answering hopefully contributes to the research community by filling a gap that you identified in the literature. So these steps are intricately linked to the previous steps, and hopefully you can connect this presentation to the previous ones. So for this presentation, we are going to look at the following points. We'll define what research gaps are. We'll look at the process for establishing research gaps, explore some type of research gaps. We'll state some common places where you can find gaps and touch a little bit on some note-taking techniques for documenting your findings as you do your search. So we hope that at the end of this talk, you should be able to understand what research gaps are and their role in research in medicine and also in public health. You should be able to grasp the process that you can follow for finding gaps in literature. And you should also be able to recognize the various types of research gaps that exist and a way to document the information that you find as you do your literature search. So to define a research gap, we can say a research gap is a topic or area for which missing or insufficient information limits the ability to reach a conclusion for a question. So it is a topic or an area, and based on that existing information, or maybe lack of that information, we cannot answer a research question. And it's very important for you to note that it is very different from a research question. A research question asks a question, and the question that might be asked might already have been answered, right? Or maybe it is not yet answered. If it is not yet answered, then there is a gap. So these are two different concepts that you should not mix up. So why is it important to establish research gaps? If you do a proper literature search and identify gaps very well, you'll notice that the research that you produce is going to be more engaging and more interesting to read, particularly for people who have been following that field, because you are going to be bringing novelty, you are going to be answering burning questions that researchers have and that they are wondering what the response will be. Secondly, research that fills a gap has a higher impact as compared to research that is just duplicating effort, repeating what has been done before. And you do research that answers a gap or is at the frontier of the field, you'll be able to create research that is more impactful and that drives the field forward. Also, if you do research that fills a very well-established gap, you'll be able to publish in really good journals. And I can say that for most top journals like a New England Journal of Medicine, Lancet, Nature, almost everything published there is really clearly filling a gap, and there's some high level of novelty. So if your research is in those areas, it's likely to be accepted in journals of that quality. Fourthly, also, if you do research that fills a well-established gap, you are more likely to get visibility, attention, and your work is likely to be cited. And this is usually not an easy thing for people who are just starting research, because usually maybe you don't yet have the expertise to do to even recognize those gaps or the resources to be able to do research that is at the frontier of your field, or be able to have the expertise to put together a study that can be published at that level. But notwithstanding, even at lower levels, there are still gaps, and as we'll see in the different types of gaps that you could create evidence for at your current level that really contribute to the field. Lastly, when you do research that feels a very clear gap, you're like, or research questions that are filling a clear gap, you are likely to get grant approvals, because grants really try to encourage people to develop research questions that fill a gap. And if you can define clearly what the gap is, then you are more likely to get your grant approved. And because grants also really want research that is based on some needs and is based on some level of innovation. And these needs and these innovations are usually hooked to a certain gap, certain lack of knowledge, a certain lack of understanding, a certain lack of methodology, or a certain lack of data, or certain approaches to answering the question. So I'm going to highlight some steps here on how you can go about establishing research gaps or finding them. And these steps are very much connected to what we saw in our previous presentations in the weeks that we've been in this program so far. And like anything in research, as we had mentioned on the first presentation on research question, you have to formulate a proper and effective research question. And the PICO framework is really a great way that you can do this. So always start with the PICO framework. And when you've established a question that is effective, the next thing you want to do, as Emma showed last week, is to define key terms that help you build a search strategy that you can apply on a search engine like PubMed to identify the kind of papers that you can read and identify where there is a gap in evidence. And when you've done that, you want now to obtain papers that come out from your literature search, and you put them maybe like on Zotero. You read these papers. You don't only read the papers, but you also look at the other publications that have been cited by the papers you are reading, and you connect and you obtain them, add to your referencing software, and you read them. And in that way, you can be able to see where information is missing, the approaches that are being used, are they sufficient? That's how gaps start to emerge as you go through that process of reading and synthesizing. And also, one thing that you want to do is, as you do this process, is to make sure that you identify issues that are addressed by the literature relating to the research question. Because when you write, you're going to maybe, like in your introduction, you say that you answer the question, what do we already know? What don't we know? And so you have to document both what we know before you can identify what we don't know. And this I will show at the last step of this presentation, why it's important and how you can do that on Zotero. So, and now we are going to explore some common types of research gaps. And please be mindful that there might seem to be some overlap as I describe them. They are not mutually exclusive. They are more descriptive to kind of give you a sense of how you can conceptualize the idea of gaps. And we'll look at 6 types of gaps. That's gap in knowledge, methodological gaps. We'll look at temporal gaps, gaps in data, theoretical gaps, and we'll finish with practice gaps. So the first gap is the knowledge gap. And I'm sure this is, most of you already know about this, and that's how you think about gaps. And so it's the most common type of research gap. So what this gap is all about is there is information, sea of knowledge that exists out there in PubMed and all the databases. And in this existing information, there are gaps. There are pieces of information that we do not know. And this lack of knowledge needs to be completed. And hopefully, if you are doing a proper research, or let me say more effective research, it should be completing those gaps that exist in the current knowledge. And for example, it could just be that we do not yet know something that is particular to a very subtopic, or there is a whole total new area that no one has explored. So the gap in knowledge can really be something very broad, or lack of knowledge in something that is very narrow, on a topic that have already been explored quite extensively. The second type of research gap is with relation to the methods or the methodology. And so what this research gap tries to do is to address flaws or limitations in the current research methods. For example, we can say, let's say the methods that the current studies have used are not the proper methods for answering that kind of research question. So there is still a gap because the study design is not robust. And to elucidate this point very well, let's look at this pyramid or hierarchy of evidence. So all study designs do not have the same level of evidence. What you see on this diagram is the way that different studies are ranked. Those at the bottom have the least weight in terms of when you're considering evidence, and those at the top have the highest level of weight. So for example, when clinical guidelines or policies are being developed, all studies are put together and they are ranked. And the decisions for what consists of evidence-based decision-making is how each of these studies contribute and based on their study design. For example, someone's opinion, like an expert in the field, is ranked as very low. Cross-sectional studies, you see, they are lower than case control studies. Case control studies are of lower weight than cohort studies. Cohort studies are of lower weight than clinical trials. And systematic reviews of clinical trials also have the highest weight. So you might have a study that is attempting to answer a question, but maybe the evidence is cross-sectional design. And if the kind of question you are trying to answer is a causal question, it's trying to answer the question, what causes what? Cross-sectional design is not a very good design for answering that kind of question. In that case, there is a gap in the methods. And so you need maybe your new study will propose to use maybe more robust study design methods to be able to answer that question and fill that gap in methods. So apart from gaps, methodological gaps that are related to study design, we also have methodological gaps that could be due to different ways in which the data is collected. So maybe you need data that is collected longitudinally, and current studies have only used cross-sectional data, or data that is collected in some format as compared to other formats that might not be appropriate for addressing your question. And lastly, it might just be due to statistical analysis techniques. There are really several ways and different ways to approach answering questions statistically. So if you use methods that are not appropriate, or maybe you do not clean the data well, you do not maybe do statistical hypothesis testing very well, or some other statistical methods, people might still question whether this is appropriately answered. So there might still be a methodological gap that is created as a result of the kind of statistical method that have been applied. So let's look at the next type of gap, the third, which is the temporal gap. And the temporal gap is really in relation to time, temporality. So when we say there is a temporal gap, it means that a topic has not been studied over a certain period. So for example, research was ongoing on psychedelics, for example, in the 60s, and then something happened, and then there was a large period between that and recently. And during that period, very limited research was done. And so it created a temporal gap because of that huge period of time. And one way that you can think about it is that it might just be due to the fact that no research has been done at all, or it might be due to the fact that maybe in recent times there have been some changes and there is need for you to reevaluate the evidence. And I think something that comes to mind when I think about temporal gaps is, for example, what are the things that could be driving this kind of gaps? And one of them could be funding. You see what's happening in the US right now. There is some funds are being cut, and we don't know how, I don't know exactly the extent to which this affects research. But imagine that if funds are cut for some kind of research, we might move maybe from now to the end of the current presidency where we do not conduct sufficient research in that area. So there is a gap in understanding during that period. Another way that I like to conceive of it is also, particularly with respect to systematic reviews. Sometimes you have a systematic review that has synthesized evidence up to a certain point, and then since that time, no one has updated the evidence as new papers came out. And so you could just define a research question that is related to systematic review design that proposes to update the evidence and fill that temporal gap. So the next type of gap is gaps that are related to data. And this kind of gaps arise as a result of insufficient or missing data on a particular topic or a particular subject or in a particular demographic or population, or it could just be on a particular key variable of interest. And this kind of gaps, these data gaps limit reliable conclusions and make it very difficult for you to broaden your findings. And there's this study that we collaborated on in 2018. We were studying we were comparing different antihypertensive combinations on Black populations. And the whole premise of that study was that a lot of the studies that had been done to determine the best combination of antihypertensive drugs were conducted mostly in Western populations. And there was insufficient data on the effectiveness of each of those combinations in Black populations. So that study was actually filling a data gap, although it was also filling a knowledge gap. And so we enrolled patients. We contributed from the Cameroon arm. The study is also ongoing in 8 other African countries. The study is published now in New England Journal of Medicine, and it actually provided new evidence that was quite specific to Africa. And it showed that the most effective combinations for our population were not only different from Western countries, but they were also different for Black people in elsewhere. So that was quite an interesting finding. And so these gaps in data could be as a limitation of sample size. For example, your sample size is not sufficient for you to really have robust conclusions. And so maybe conducting studies with a larger sample size will be important to complete that gap. It might just be like in the example that I was discussing earlier, would be that studies have not been done in a particular area. And for people who are starting research, oftentimes your justification for your research is that maybe a lot is already known in the Western world or other parts of the world. Little to no evidence exists in our context. So somehow your research is filling a gap in data. Or you can say that while there is research in East Africa or West Africa, little or nothing is known about that idea or that concept or that phenomenon in Cameroon. And so it could also be a certain demographic group. We, for example, don't know how something works in pregnant women, or maybe we don't know how it works in MSM, or we don't know how it works in men above 80 years. So these gaps might be as a result of each of these different aspects. So the fifth gap is a gap in theory. And as you know very well, in research always kind of flows from an idea to practice, right? So you have someone have a conjecture or an idea, and they try to develop a good explanation for how that works. And when they develop that's a theory or a theoretical framework that has been brought up. Sometimes you have a gap, which is just that there is no theory, or that current theories that exist are not very explanatory or very strong. And so this gap can present itself in different ways. It could just be that there is no theory at all. It could be that current theories are weak or they are not adequate, or maybe we have just too many theories that are conflicting and are not very explanatory. Or it's that people cannot effectively translate this theory from a concept to experimentation. So for most of us who are dealing with medical research from a clinical standpoint or public health, I'm not sure we encounter too much theoretical gaps as compared to people who are doing basic sciences. For example, if you're in immunology, you might have You might need new theories for how CD4 cells behave in the context of HIV or something. So these gaps really are at the beginning of the research process. So the last type of gap is practice gaps. And you can also call this kind of gaps the no-do gap, right? Which is the whole point of implementation science. And in the module on implementation science, this is going to be covered extensively. And I think this is a very important field that is still kind of fresh in our settings. And I'm anticipating that this is going to be an exciting module for most of us. And I'm really looking forward to it. So what this gap is all about is we already have a lot of papers published on ways to go about X or Y. But in practice, are people really doing what has been shown in published literature? And there is really huge evidence to show that it takes about sometimes up to 17 years for information to move from knowledge to practice. And so implementation science aims to bridge this gap in practice. And there are multiple ways that implementation science goes about this, but maybe just to highlight a few of them, implementation science tries to address, for example, issues like barriers. So what prevents the adoption of the evidence into practice? And also looked at facilitators, for example, what are the things that can facilitate adoption of existing evidence into practice? Can explore some strategies. How can we overcome barriers to adoption of knowledge that is already existing? It can also just be measuring success in the real world settings. What do we know? How it's implemented? Is it really working? So I think this is a very exciting area, and I think more people should consider doing implementation science kind of work and learning more about it. So this concludes the types of research gaps that are out there. So I'm going to touch on some key points here, which I think are quite interesting, which is how do research gaps come into existence, or how do they emerge? And sometimes they just emerge because there is some emerging public health issue. And so, for example, we were all doing fine until like 2019, and then we are hit by the pandemic. So around February 2020, we don't even really know the mechanism, what the COVID virus is, the nature of the disease, the pathophysiology, the clinical presentation, right to public health related implementation gaps. So when you have public health emergencies, a lot of research gaps emerge. And the pandemic is very, very good evidence for the tons of research questions that emerged during that time. And I think everyone that is involved in biomedical research had a lot of questions. If they had the means, they had a lot of questions that they could really address. The second type of emergence is from advances in medical technology, and AI is one of those emerging technologies that is going to have very huge implications in medicine and public health. And there are questions on how can we use AI for diagnosis? How do we integrate it in telemedicine? For example, precision medicine that arises from genomics, genetics, AI. These are areas that are emerging as the technologies also evolve. We don't know how effective these new technologies are in practice. We don't know ethical implications. So these are hot areas. If you follow a journal like the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, they really publish a lot. They have a whole area on AI and precision medicine. And if you also follow like Nature and Lancet, they also talk a lot. So this is really a frontier area with a lot of research gaps. The next is demographic and epidemiological changes. So we know very well that as populations age, grow, or change, new health challenges emerge. And when I think about this, there are two key areas that demonstrate this very well. The first is how Africa has transitioned. And we call this the epidemiological transition in Africa, like the emergence of non-communicable disease in Africa. As Africans have westernized their lifestyles, a lot of NCDs have emerged, which were not as prevalent or incident as before. So this is as a result of changes in our demography and changes in some epidemiological aspects. And another area where this is quite evident is in HIV research, as new antiretroviral therapy treatments are becoming more effective. The deaths are dropping, and so concerns are that as these people are now living longer and aging, they are really more prone now to diseases of aging, like the NCDs and the different cardiometabolic disorders. And so there's a huge emergence of NCDs in HIV populations. It's one of those frontier areas in that particular aspect. And then lastly, you can have research gaps emerge from inconsistent research results. So as you read papers that you found from your literature search, you will notice that some results report positively, some report negatively, some report indifferently. And it's important for you to think about what are the reasons why there are these inconsistencies. And from this process, you can maybe develop a research question that addresses or tries to address or resolve this inconsistency. And hopefully, if you design that very well, then you close a gap that is as a result of that inconsistency. And so the next question, where do you look for research gaps? And so we've established this clearly, even from the last presentation. You look for them by doing an extensive literature search. So you check PubMed, as we showed last week, but there are also other databases. There's Embase, there's Scopus. And if you're in Africa, never forget Africa Journal Online. So there are a lot of journals in Africa that are not PubMed indexed, meaning that if you only search PubMed, you might miss them and go forward and say there are no studies that have been done, but actually there are studies that have been done that are not indexed by PubMed. So always check Africa Journal of Africa Journals Online. I think some common journals that are there, like the Journal of the University of Douala is indexed at Ajol, Journal of the University of Buea and University of Yaoundé one, alongside other journals within Cameroon. You are less likely to find them on PubMed, but they are on Africa Journals Online. Always try to complement it when you do your literature search. The next place is, there's some places that I will consider some spatial avenues where you easily find research gaps. So as you read, look very keenly at the limitation section. We researchers are expected to be clear about what the limits are to our study. And if you think about the different research gaps that we've established, you will notice that each of them, of the items that are mentioned in the limitation section, are actually clearly the different types of research gaps. Someone can say, oh, we cannot, because we are using a cross-sectional design, for example, we cannot infer causality. And so that is a gap in methodology, or maybe say our sample size was small, and so that's a gap in data. So you see that in the limitation sections, you are more likely to see where the gaps are. And this is a very nice thing to always describe the limitations of your work. The next place where you can really find papers is systematic reviews. This is the whole point of systematic reviews. Systematic reviews kind of help you do the literature or the literature search. So the point of systematic reviews is to look at what is known about a topic, a particular topic that has been clearly defined, and to synthesize the evidence and draw a conclusion. And so maybe if you want to maybe even start this whole process, you might want to just go see whether there are already systematic reviews that are done in the area where you are interested in exploring. You want to just go see if there's a review, then maybe all the evidence you need is already established there. So always check if there's a systematic review in the direction of what you have been done. Another awesome place is editorials and comments to papers. This is particularly for frontier topics, like topics that are the hot topics in the field. The experts will always drop commentaries. They always maybe send replies to new papers that have been published to make comments. So you will see they are addressing comments, highlighting maybe what is not yet known, highlighting maybe weaknesses in papers, and all of that commentary and all of that conversation, research gaps are really oozing out, and they're establishing really gaps that you could just pick up easily. And the next is expert opinions, which is quite much related to editorials. For example, if you I read this paper and it was very interesting. The paper was almost like establishing research gaps. So this is a paper, Prof. Andre Pascal was one of the contributors here, and they were looking at applying the WHO global targets for diabetes mellitus. So they approached each region, and Prof. Andre Pascal was contributing for the African region, and he was just highlighting all the different ways in which we are still lagging behind, both from the conceptual issues to issues, right, to issues of practice, issues of data, and all of that. So this is kind of a gold mine if you are looking for frontier topics. The last is conferences and meetings. Really, a lot of the abstracts that are presented in high value conferences and research meetings is just gaps, addressing gaps. So if you attend conferences like the International AIDS Conference, CROI for HIV, you see that the key discussions are around gaps, trying to fill gaps. So I'm almost done. So I'm showing here an example of Zotero, and this is a screenshot. So let's say you've identified your papers and you've imported them into your referencing software like Zotero. It's important for you to read and read and read and highlight. And in highlighting it, you can create sub-notes, right, that you can see here. These are notes, and they are built by topics or themes depending on what you are interested in. So you can highlight, and the nice thing about Zotero is that if you highlight things and you paste, you can click in the notes and it takes you back to the document. So it makes it very easy to go back. So this is a feature that I strongly recommend as you obtain your papers. Read, highlight, highlight the gaps. You can see here, there's a limitation section, some gaps highlighted here, where in this paper, the authors say, first, our study population represents patients enrolled in two multi-center prospective studies of treatment-naive patients initiating government-sponsored currently available ART regimens at the time of enrollment. Therefore, our findings might be influenced by differences in two studies. So there is a methodological gap here. If you were writing your paper, maybe if your study is building on this study, you might say, yeah, while these people have reported this, their paper has this weakness, which is the gap. And then yours now promises to fill this gap by using this method, something of that sort. So what I'm highlighting here is that you should use referencing softwares very well to read papers, take notes, group your gaps, identify them, highlight them, and link them so that your study will be kind of contributing by filling that gap. So these are some of the different ways that you could highlight as you read papers. So you read across papers, you take notes, you could have methodology where you just highlight the different study designs. So you copy maybe the text or you write your own notes on the different study designs that have been used. And the limitation section, you can put together all the different things that have been highlighted across the different papers as limitations. And discussions, you can see how they discuss their results and how they propose better ways. Because sometimes in the discussion section, someone highlights better ways or recommendations for future research, which will help you address your gaps. So in conclusion, I want to emphasize that do research that fills a relevant gap, because this is the kind of research that drives impact and innovation and contribute to the field. The point of research is not just to do an academic activity, but also to at least do something that helps the research community advance. And you should use extensive literature search as identified right from the last lecture. Look at systematic reviews, look at papers that highlight expert opinions. Think about real world challenges every day around you. research gaps are existing along this spectrum. And I can say that look at your field with fresh eyes. Ask yourself, what's missing? What is it that we don't yet understand? What is it that is unexplored? And know that you cannot know this without doing proper literature search. And for that reason, you have to read. You cannot skip that step. If you have to do impactful research, you must read, and read sufficiently to be able to know where your research is going to be fitting in the broader research knowledge. Thank you very much. We'll end here, and then we are going to take questions, comments, and remarks. But before we do that, as usual, we'll give the